Good morning. Welcome to Viewpoints. My name is Elizabeth Robinson. Our topic this morning is going to be the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza Strip, the occupied territories. Those areas, most of you probably know, have been occupied by Israel since 1967. I have with me a guest today who is Palestinian, and I would like to welcome him for starters.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
But before going to that, I would like to make a few introductory remarks. I think primary among them is that I think we need to appreciate a Palestinian coming to speak to us at all. What I'm trying to say obliquely maybe is that at this point in time, there are political pressures in this country and in Israel as well, which have inhibited or intimidated many Palestinians, indeed many Arabs in this country, and has served to silence many of them. Let me be very specific. You may know that there is an ongoing case in the Los Angeles area, which began about 10 months ago now, in which 8 Palestinian Americans, or American residents of America in any case, were arrested by the Immigration and Naturalization Service for allegedly being in violation of the McCarran-Walter Act. The McCarran-Walter Act is a hangover from the McCarthy period, and basically what it alleges is that people or persons are a risk to Americans somehow for their ideas. The ideas of these particular people, the 8 who were arrested in Los Angeles, actually 7 of them were Palestinians, and one of them was a Kenyan woman who had the audacity to marry a Palestinian, apparently. That was her only crime, so far as we know. In any case, all of them advocated Palestinian nationalism, and in doing so, they were distributing literature, and that was it. So they were exercising what we presume is a right of free speech in this country. But for that, they were investigated for several months by the FBI, and when the FBI was unable to make a criminal case against them, they then turned to the Immigration and Naturalization Service in order to try to deport these people, one of whom had been a resident for over 13 years. I'm told I need to identify the station, and let me stop and do this. This is KCSB 91.9 FM in Santa Barbara. In any case, the point is that the Palestinian community and the Arab community have been told in no uncertain terms that they are not entitled to the rights of free speech that we had all presumed they were entitled to. I might just mention as an aside, for those of you who think if you're not Arab or Palestinian that this isn't an issue for you, that the INS office which is handling these cases, or which brought these charges, is the same one headed by Ezel, who Senator Alan Cranston is now trying to have removed from his position. Ezel has been known to make incredibly racist remarks in regard to the current, the new immigration policy, the amnesty laws, and so on, which are affecting so many from the Latin American community. Let me give you a very gross example of the sorts of things that Ezel has done. Very recently, he was speaking in Santa Maria, I believe, and said quite publicly and quite proudly, as he gave immigration papers to a mariachi band which was playing for the occasion, he said that those band members now not only could legally pick berries, but they could legally play in any mariachi band in this country. I hope I don't have to tell you what's racist about that statement. In any case, it's not simply Ezel. Ezel is a problem, certainly. But the other thing which has happened recently in this country, which is an index of the degree to which Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, are not protected by the Bill of Rights. The U.S. Senate has recently passed a law calling for the closure of the Palestinian National Congress office in Washington, D.C. They are representatives of the Palestinian people in this country, whom, of course, have no legal state and therefore do not have the same entitlements to embassies and so on and so forth. But even some of the people whom we consider our most liberal senators, like Senator Edward Kennedy, sponsored this bill to close this office because it supported the Palestinian Liberation Organization. On the face of it, that is inappropriate, according to Senator Edward Kennedy, and of course his friends on the right, like Senator Robert Dole. So I want to be very clear at the outset that coming anywhere and publicly advocating the rights of Palestinians, or even suggesting that it's something that should be entertained, can carry a heavy burden for the speaker. And so I appreciate that to begin with. I have not mentioned the fact that if one is also a resident of the occupied territories, as is my guest today, speaking out against Israeli policy also carries a heavy burden. It means hassles when one tries to go between one's home and any other country. Visas are always a problem. Entry and exit into the occupied territories is always uncertain, and there have been many occasions when someone has not been allowed to re-enter or to leave after having returned to the territories or at the point of trying to return. There are as well, for many people, the threat of harassment of their families there. So I want to be very uncompromising about that. I also want to state fairly unequivocally that the territories that we're speaking about today, the occupied territories, are just that. There is no legal claim on the part of the Israeli state to these territories, although at this point in time there is a considerable civil claim insofar as Israelis have, at this point in time, control over much of the property, private property in the country and in the occupied territories. So, with all that as a beginning, let me move to the issues very immediately that we are concerned with. In the past 2 weeks, there have been a series of reports coming out of Israel which suggest an escalation in resistance and perhaps violence in the occupied territories, particularly in the Gaza Strip. I want to say that when we say that there has been an increase or an escalation, it's very difficult to measure. There is a constant series of events involving clashes between the citizens of the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian people, and the occupying forces, both the army and now the settler population, the Israeli settler population, which is encroaching on the Palestinians' territory at an alarming rate. To give you just an example, I had picked up some papers recently. All of these, by the way, I think with one or two exceptions, are from the Jerusalem Post. So this is an Israeli source. But in any case, on October 5th, for example, not part of this latest upsurge, there was an event in which 11 Arab students were held, presumably for attacking a group of Jewish teenagers, according to the... However, the Post says that the official story... Perhaps you can begin by giving us a bit of an overview of the occupation. As I mentioned, it's been 20 years on now, and you can maybe begin by giving us an idea of what the conditions of people's daily lives are like.
Well, the first thing I think that one ought to realize is that there are certain qualifications for an occupying power or force. For an occupation to be considered as an occupation, it has to be oppressive. And carrying out oppression by the Israeli occupation entails imposition of daily harassment on Palestinians living in the occupied territories as well as Palestinians living outside the occupied territories. But since our topic today deals particularly with Palestinians in the occupied territories, I think we'll limit ourselves to that. Since 1967, there has been relatively an entire generation living under the occupation. Children grew up knowing nothing but harassment, oppression, daily imprisonment, house arrest, murder, injury, closure of universities, schools, youth clubs, kindergartens, and all other sorts of harassments that one may think of. The reason it is done, basically, either to force the Palestinians out of the occupied territories so that the land will be emptied from its indigenous population, and so that the Israelis will build more settlements on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, so that within relatively few years, the Israelis will make a claim that this land is inhabited solely by Israelis, and therefore it is part of Israel. Now, this is a debatable issue, since internal Israeli politics somehow provides different perspectives on that. But as it appears to be, I would say that even the difference between Israeli parties tend to focus on the mechanism of emptying the occupied territories rather than on the substance.
So you're saying that neither the Likud bloc or the Labour bloc has seriously planned for withdrawal from the territories?
There is talk about that, especially by the Labour Party, the Marach. But in essence, even if there has to be withdrawal, the withdrawal will be basically symbolic. Now, for the Likud, it's a clear-cut opinion. The Likud wants to forcefully expel the Palestinians out of the occupied territories, to bring in more settlers to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And they do that in too many ways, as you mentioned very qualifiedly. Daily killing of Palestinians, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, imposing curfews on refugee camps, Palestinian cities and towns, closure of universities. All of these things lead, or at least intend to lead, the Palestinians to become tired of the situation there and to leave.
And indeed it happens.
To an extent it happens, but what's really happening now, that for the Palestinians, they think like this: even if they leave, where are they going to go? They are not welcome in any other country. And even, let's say, if they go to Jordan, to Lebanon, which is basically what many Palestinians had to do when they were forced out of Palestine, first in 1948, about 800,000 Palestinians became refugees in Lebanon. And again in 1967, a similar number was forced out to Jordan, to Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. What happened is basically the harassment, the oppression, the genocide against the Palestinians continued even outside the occupied territories. And I think the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, before that in 1978, and even before that, the continuous air raids by Israel on Palestinian refugee camps basically are exemplifications of such a fact.
In terms of the territories themselves, one of the things which is for the Israeli government both a well, it's a contradiction, I suppose. It's a problem for them, but it's one that they can't easily resolve. Is it not true that the territories have become a very important labor pool for the Israeli economy? And how does that affect the nature of the relationship between the two areas?
That's a very good and very important point at the very same time. As I said before, and I repeat, there are certain qualifications for power to be considered as an occupying power. Tens of thousands of Palestinians find no other alternative but to be laborers in Israeli factories, companies, construction, and so on. Not only that they are underpaid by the Israelis, they are exploited, they are enslaved, they have no rights, no legal or even illegal rights that they are entitled to at all. Take, for example, if an Israeli worker is paid, let's assume $600, a Palestinian worker will definitely be paid no more than $200. The Israeli worker has insurance, has other rights that he or she is entitled to. Palestinian worker has none. Now, let's assume that in such a case, Palestinian workers will become tired of the situation and say, well, let's unionize. Let's try to submit some Bill of Rights to the authorities. And let's expect that the authorities will hear our requests. First of all, there is an outright prevention for unionization by Palestinians for any form of organization, social, political, any form of organization that somebody may think of. Mm-hmm. Besides that, I think the atmosphere there is established in a way where the Palestinians will find no other alternative but to try to attain survivability by working in Israel. Mm-hmm. First of all, if a Palestinian family or a group of families have a certain piece of land, they can farm it. Well, land is getting confiscated every day. If Palestinian professionals want to build a factory, to construct a factory or a company, they have to get license from the Israeli authorities. Mm-hmm. They usually don't get it. If they want to work in export-import relations, they have also to get licenses from the Israeli authorities. The Israeli authorities doesn't give them this at all. The reason or the motive behind it is to make these people tired, to perpetuate the myth that Palestine is a land without people.
I think that's the kind of myth that we grow up with in this country, or we did very much, at least a generation ago. It's one that's very hard to sustain at this point. But I want to, before we go on, I want to emphasize one of the things that you say. I think there is an occasion when we hear terms that don't mean anything to us, or that we presume are exaggerations. And in terms of the repression of Palestinian laborers in Israel, one thing that I think I would like to add to those which you mentioned is that day laborers who go from the occupied territories to Israel to work must return each night. They may not legally stay in Israel overnight. This is something that we are very familiar with in the South African case, and we call it apartheid. And I think the parallel is very obvious here. But let me ask you about these current events. I'm going to just sort of throw out 3 or 4 questions, and I'll let you pick and choose among the ones that you think are appropriate. One, of course, is we've sort of both touched on, and that is whether or not there really is anything special about these latest events, or whether or not they're part of a pattern. And certainly it seems we agree that they're part of a much longer series of events. But there have been 2 or 3 things which were mentioned, which I think are important for us to consider. One of which was there have been references in the Jerusalem Post especially, but also in places like the Washington Post Weekly, that there is a new character to these latest clashes. One is the suggestion that these acts have been initiated by Palestinians who are involved with something called Islamic Jihad. Now, I don't want to get into a long religious discussion here, but we should say that in terms of what we've come to know about is Islamic Jihad. That has been a predominantly Shia Muslim organization, and there are very few Shia Muslim Palestinians. But more importantly, whether or not it fits in terms of a particular sect, I think one of the things that we have to ask is whether or not there is a religious component to this resistance that is different than the past. The Palestinian Liberation Organization and most of Palestinian activism has always been characterized as secular, as drawing no lines across religions or races, tactics.
Well, first of all, let me indicate that concerning the unconfirmed reports on Israeli raids on Palestinian houses, this is not something new. It's an ongoing, systematic occurrence perpetuated by the Israeli authorities, which goes in line with the nature of the occupation, the brutal occupation. The refugee camps, the cities, the universities get raided almost every day to an extent. Now, whether the recent escalation is a new development or whether it's a reflection on an old pattern perpetuated by the occupation, let me start out by saying that not much has changed. Unrest in the occupied territories is ongoing. Israeli harassment daily takes place against the Palestinians. Some form of reaction by the Palestinians takes place against such harassment. But what's happening lately is that the attention has been, or some kind of attention has been drawn by the media to the occupied territories, basically to give more focus, to stress the latest visit by George Shultz to the Middle East. Before I touch on this, let me say something about the categorization of Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic Jihad in the occupied territories. Something often misconstrued is that Palestinians are not only Muslims, they are Christians, they are Palestinian Jews, and the protest against the occupation, the discomfort caused by the occupation, is not reflected on Muslims only. It's reflected on Palestinians within, as a society. Christians don't like the occupation, Muslims don't like the occupation, some Jews don't like the occupation either. But what's really happening, in my opinion, that there is an attempt, there is a tendency to connect the recent unrest in the occupied territories with Islamic fundamentalism as it is portrayed in the media in regard to to Islamic Jihad, basically in Lebanon, the group that is holding Western hostages. Mm-hmm. If such kind of an association takes place, the public, especially in the United States, will not really feel sympathetic to any kind of harassment perpetrated by the Israelis against the Palestinians, because there is an association there with individuals who are holding hostages. Mm-hmm. Now, if we look at some of the recent reports that came from the occupied territories, even reports from the Israeli authorities themselves, investigations with some Palestinians who were part of the recent unrest, I think they declared it very publicly and unhesitatingly that there is no association whatsoever between being Muslim and between the unrest, because any individual, any group of individuals, if it was subjected or subjugated by another force, has to react. And that's basically what's happening.
I should add to that that even the Jerusalem Post says, talks about this Islamic Jihad, and then says there is absolutely no connection to what we have known as Islamic Jihad. So there is that the beginning of a disclaimer, the beginning of a chink in that sort of thing. But let me talk about it in slightly different terms. I think that I certainly agree with you in terms of the impact of associating it with Islamic Jihad. The Washington Post, but what about this as a policy in the occupied territories? Has that been an Israeli policy, and has it been effective at all? One of the things that Frankel is saying, obviously, is that it's backfiring.
Well, I think the Israeli authorities tries every mean somehow to contain the legitimate Palestinian representation inside and outside the occupied territories. To do so, they have tried to establish the village leagues. The village leagues, basically people who are on the margin of the society, which means that people who are not really concerned about politics, they are concerned about their own personal welfare, and the Israeli authorities tried this outlet. They didn't succeed. They try every other mean somehow to contain Palestinian consensus, as I said, inside and outside the occupied territories, and it is very probable that they have tried to use, let's say, Islamic Islamic forces or some components of Islam to pull the rug from under the feet of Palestinian consensus in the occupied territories. But to my knowledge, so far the Israelis are not succeeding really in containing Palestinian consensus in the occupied territories. They have proved to fail every time they try. Concerning the article you refer to, Elizabeth, I think the author deliberately tries to provide some kind of perpetuated stereotype there. He talks about the Islamic University in Gaza, some of the traditions taking place at the university and so on. He never dares to talk, let's say, about other universities, other Palestinian universities. He tries to portray that there is some kind of a beast, ugly beast, there at the Islamic University in Gaza, things that are really different from the West. Some veiled women, some separation between, some separation in sexes and so on. It's a very clear attempt at stereotyping, as I said, the recent unrest with some kind of association that has been going on here in this country for a long time, that this is an ugly beast. It should be fought by all means. He doesn't talk about Birzeit University, let's say Bethlehem University, with absolutely Western standards of education. He never dares to talk about this. So he has some kind of a motivation behind his article, and he imposes some kind of value judgment on the reader.
I'm just reminded, I heard a report yesterday that Bethlehem University has in fact been closed down for at least a month following demonstrations there. That has been very typical. To finish a school year without interruption, I think, is unheard of. I'm not sure. It's been a tragedy, I think, for the people of the territories, occupied territories, for a very long time, because very often the disruptions come at the point of examinations.
Let me indicate something on this line, if you will, please, Elizabeth. What's happening lately at Bethlehem University, as I said, is part of the overall reflection on the occupied territories, harassment, reaction. Just to tell you some, personal encounters, which is basically part of an overall situation for an entire people. In other words, what I'm going to say somehow is only one sample. I was admitted to Birzeit University in '81. We started the first semester on October 12, 1981. On November 2nd, the university was closed by the Israeli authorities for 2 months. For no reason other than the students basically wanted to hold a meeting, just to discuss university affairs, the harassments by the Israeli authorities, and so on. As a response, the Israeli authorities closed the university for 2 months. On January 4th, the university reopened. It was closed again on February 26th for 2 more months. That's in 1982. In April, the university reopened. Now, before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the Israelis tried to sweep any possibility for reaction in the occupied territories against the invasion. So they closed the university for 3 more months. Now imagine the university was closed for 7 months in one academic year. Mm-hmm. Let's try to imagine, if we can, that UCSB gets closed, God forbids, for 1 month or for 7 months just because the students want to hold a meeting. What kind of reaction will we have? I am sure that students, faculty, nobody at all will be pleased and will accept such occurrence. Now, let alone, if this tends to be a daily encounter, I think there will be some kind of reaction.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. The other half of that question that I asked you earlier, Hisham, let me ask once again, and I will add a third component to it, actually, and that is whether or not there has been an escalation in tactics, whether there is a rise in the use of weapons. And secondly, something which I had told you that I would hoped you would talk about is the degree to which there is or has been a difference in reaction to the occupation among the residents of Gaza as compared to the rest of the country. I should just say that when we talk about the Gaza Strip, we're talking about a very small landmass indeed, and one that is also being encroached upon with Israeli settlements. So, but usually when we've heard about demonstrations of any sort, unrest and so on, we have been focusing on the West Bank primarily. That has been the characterization most often. It's most often seems to have been centralized or centered in the West Bank and not in Gaza. Is that different?
Well, in a way, in response to the first part of the question, whether there has been a change in tactics by the Palestinians in the occupied territories against the Israeli authorities or not, I think there is some shift there. There is some change, because what you really have is more sophistication used by the Israeli authorities to harass the Palestinians now. Their means developed, their way of, let's say, subjugating the Palestinians also changed. So you will have a natural shift in tactics used by the Palestinians in the occupied territories, especially that they are becoming more tired of the occupation. So now what you really have is that almost every child talks about nothing more than he talks about the occupation, thinks of nothing more than he thinks of the occupation, because the economic situation is so depressed, the social situation is so depressed, the psychology is so tired of the occupation, let alone political rights, national rights, and so on. Now, concerning Gaza, I think we ought to remember that the Gaza Strip somehow witnessed strong Palestinian resistance against the occupation in the early 70s. The crack by the Israeli authorities on Gaza, therefore, was very strong in the early 70s. They depressed the society in Gaza very strongly, namely the Israelis. Now, what we really have now is some kind of a re-emergence, a regurgitation of resistance in Gaza. But what we ought to be careful about is not to draw a line between the West Bank and Gaza at all. As I mentioned before, there is an attempt at associating the current unrest with Islamic Jihad, or so-called Islamic Jihad, or quote-unquote, if you will, Islamic Jihad in Lebanon, to associate them with the current unrest in the occupied territories. Now in Gaza, there is a university called Islamic University. That's an easy target to make that association. But the unrest has been going on for a long time, because the oppression and the brutality of the occupation has been going on for a long time as well.
You had mentioned that there were differences in terms of, I suppose, the degree to which the Gazans are really surrounded and contained by Israel as compared to people in the West Bank. Is that a significant difference, do you think?
I would say definitely it plays a role, but again, I'm really cautious at drawing a line between developments in Gaza and the West Bank, because the Palestinian community, although dispersed throughout the world because of the occupation, has some kind of unifying dynamism behind it, which is basically dispersion, diaspora, harassment, brutality of circumstances perpetuated by the occupation, and so on. So what you really have is some kind of an organic response between the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, and so on. I mentioned the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Before Israel invaded Lebanon, 1982, they dismissed all Palestinian mayors who were democratically elected by Palestinians. They had a tremendous
They
had a tremendous crackdown on all Palestinian institutions. I said they closed Birzeit University, closed Al-Najah University, Bethlehem, Hebrew University, and so on. And they planned assassination attempts at some of the Palestinian mayors, namely Nablus, Ramallah, and Al-Bira. What's really unfortunate, if you would allow me to add, is that such things are really not heard of often here. So, I mean, analyzing an occurrence, analyzing a development is often very one-sidedly done. How many of us really hear or heard about this woman that Elizabeth talked about? She was just getting out of the car to get some bread, that she was killed while she was getting to the shop. We didn't hear about her. How many of us heard about several Palestinians being just shot at while they were walking the street? And even if some of us hear about them, we will equate them immediately with terrorism, as if these people genetically are terrorists, and therefore, whether with reason or without reason, I mean, murdering them, killing them is really justified.
Let me add another case to this, I think, which is, again, it's coming from an Israeli source, which is not unbiased, the Jerusalem Post. At one of the occasions in which several civilians were shot, a shopkeeper was shot, and what he was doing was closing his shop. There had been a call for a general strike and for the closure of the commercial districts, and his offense was that he was closing his shop. The authorities claimed that the shooting had been accidental, but he was at the gate of his shop pulling down a closure, a door of some sort, when he was shot. And there were passers-by who also said that the shooting was at random at people on the street. So the reason I keep mentioning these incidents is not to somehow suggest that there are individual cases, but to give you a sense that it is happening and that there are people attached to these things. This is not happening to masses. These are happening to individual people, and I think that's one of the things when you talked about your experience at Birzeit, which is important to remember. When you close down a university, you don't close down an institution. You do that, but you also affect individuals' lives in a very profound way.
I mean, almost 2,000 Palestinian families got affected by the closure of the university frequently.
I'd like to move. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to go to the other side of this coin and ask about the effects of the occupation on Israelis. Now, if you're alarmed out there that I'm asking a Palestinian about this, I would just say that there are Israelis commenting on Palestinians all the time, so I think it's not unusual at all. In any case, do you think that the occupation has changed the character of the Israeli state, of the Israeli people in any ways, and would you like to comment on in what ways, if so?
I would say yes, indeed, in too many ways. On one hand, some Israelis are becoming more reinforced to attempt to subjugate the Palestinians. Take the Kahane group, for example. Meir Kahane, who is a member of the Israeli Knesset, namely the Israeli parliament. The settlers supporting Kahane, who often tend to come from abroad, namely from the West, tend to have an unclear idea about what's going on. They come with very entrenched thoughts in their mind that these Palestinians shouldn't be there, and so on, and they get their ideas reinforced by Kahane and his group, which is not only a group, it's a party, it's a political party that is becoming stronger and stronger. Now, that's the first, I would say, effect or dimension. The second one, some Israelis are becoming really tired of becoming an occupying force. And these tend to be basically the professionals, the very well educated Israeli professors in universities, Israeli lawyers, and so on. They don't want the occupation to go on because it is adding an extremely negative characteristic to the nature of the Israeli politics, and so on. Now, very recently, I read some reports about almost 15 Israeli soldiers writing to Yitzhak Rabin, the defense minister, telling him that they don't want to serve in the West Bank and the Gaza in the Israeli army because they don't want to be part of an occupying force. And they are asking him to serve only in the 1948 territories called Israel. Now, this is a very important development. Israeli soldiers are realizing that they are becoming an occupying force. The same thing happened in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. Few soldiers decided to not to go to the invasion, and that's against Israeli law. They prefer to face imprisonment rather than taking an action which is unjustifiable. The unfortunate part about it that these are a minority, but definitely the characteristic of Israel is an occupying force, and Israelis know it. Some of them accept it, some of them don't.
I would comment. There have been several, or two or three, surprisingly critical pieces on American television lately. One of them on the public broadcast network, and the other one on NBC, which addressed some of these very things that you're talking about. And there is a resistance among a small Israeli left, and I think that's important. But the other thing that was very discouraging, I know to some Israeli friends of mine, was that many of the people who are now moving into the West Bank, for example, are doing so out of strictly economic considerations. They can get a cheaper, better house closer to their work if they live in the occupied territories. So it's not a question of some settler fervor such as has characterized some of the early settlements. Now it's just a simple-minded pragmatism, and that's very distressing, that sort of thing. In the last few minutes that we have, maybe you would like to comment on what you think are the prospects for the territories and for, indeed, the Palestinian people in the State of Israel. I know 5 minutes won't do, but maybe you can offer a couple of thoughts at least.
Well, to start out, I would say that the outlook looks to be grim. This is not a pessimistic view at all. I would say it's a very realistic one. The reason because among the Palestinians, as I said, the feeling that everybody is tired of the occupation, nobody is in need for peace more than the Palestinians because they are the victims, they are under the occupation. They are not above the occupation. They are not the authority. They are under the mercy of the authority. So they are really, they are the ones who really need peace, let alone want it. The Israeli government so far didn't show any willingness to enter into real settlement, very just settlement for all parties involved in the conflict. And this has been perpetuated by the American government unconditional support to Israeli politics, namely concerning the International Peace Conference. The Israeli government so far is rejecting the idea of the International Peace Conference. Shamir, the Prime Minister, says that he is just willing for a regional conference where the Palestinians or some Palestinian individuals of his own selection and his own acceptance will participate in such a conference, and the outcome of this will not be Palestinian national rights, but basically another form of Palestinian subjugation. The Israeli government is refusing to talk or to sit down with the legitimate representative of the Palestinians, the PLO, internationally recognized, domestically among the Palestinians recognized, and regionally recognized. The Israeli government is not willing to do so under the slogan that the PLO is involved in terrorist acts and so on. Terrorism is something becoming like a beast. Everybody talks about it, but really nobody probably knows what it is. Who's to talk about terrorism? The ones who are the occupying power or the ones under occupation? It's an irony of history, and it's a very, how shall I say it, depressing irony to an extent. The PLO is willing to sit in an international conference to discuss the matter. So far there has been no push from the United States or from Israel. To the contrary, there has been an attempt to contain the idea of the international conference so that there won't be peace.
I think we're going to have to stop there. I think if those of you who are out there want information, there are a lot of sources available. I would suggest as one good source the book called The Fateful Triangle by Noam Chomsky, which gives you a good sense of both the situation and the U.S. role in it, which is not a negligible one. For now, for Viewpoints and KCSB, this is Elizabeth Robinson. I would again like to thank my guest for coming, and I hope that it was informative for you out there. Please tune in next week, same time, for Viewpoints.
The opinions you have heard on this program were those of the person speaking, and not necessarily the opinions of KCSB, the Associated Students, or the University of California Regents. If you have a comment or wish to respond, please write to P.O. Box 13401, Santa Barbara, California, 93107. This is KCSB FM Santa Barbara, Community Service Broadcast.